Despite what you may think, even presidents need to eat. Here are some favorite foods of United States presidents throughout history, showing us how much America's culinary style has changed. Starting off with one of the most iconic presidents in the entire list, George Washington himself, the very first. He was believed to be an avid fan of hoe cakes. While his White House feasts consisted of things like pork, goose, mince pies, and more, he always kicked off his day with hoe cakes. These are pancakes made from cornmeal, and people even popularized their own takes on the breakfast by calling it George Washington's breakfast. John Adams was quite the patriot, both in his politics and in his choice of dining, as he always picked produce and game that was near his own hometown in Massachusetts. Most reports that reference his dietary habits tell us that he actually loved a New England boiled dinner, and we know you may have been expecting steak and eggs instead. Adams would always include beef, pork, or chicken, and lots of vegetables to make a hearty stew. Thomas Jefferson was one of the founding fathers of the nation and one of the OG sweet tooths as well, and he was known for his specific love of French vanilla ice cream. We are not sure if the recipe was his own creation or the handiwork of his trusty butler who was known to dabble in some French cooking. Either way, his ice cream was made of eggs and had a particularly thick consistency that Jefferson was very fond of. And who can blame him? Despite his rather small size, James Madison was known for having quite an appetite when it came to his love of Virginia ham, particularly smoked ham. Now, this was already a pretty popular choice for Virginia natives as far as their top 3 foods went, but when you get a president rooting for you, it adds some cultural value to the dish. If there is anything Virginia is unrivaled at, it is their delectable ham, so it's not hard to put 2 and 2 together and see why this was his favorite. James Monroe had more in common with Madison than just a first name. They both hailed from Virginia, but Mr. Monroe prized the spoonbread over the state's widely known ham. The story behind spoonbread is that once, at Monroe's home, a cornmeal mush was baked in the oven, which was not the standard way of making it, but the result was spoonbread, and Monroe made sure to keep it on the menu ever since. John Quincy Adams, on the other hand, was probably the healthiest president of his time, as he was both a fanatic gardener and someone who really enjoyed the fruits of his labor. In his case, we mean that quite literally, as his favorite food was just a collection of fruits he would regularly grow in his garden, the best of which he claimed were his plums, apples, and peaches. Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of America, brought an air of sophistication with his favorite food being a tenderloin with Jezebel sauce. The addition of Jezebel sauce really sets this dish apart because the pairing of meat with a sweet sauce made with apples, pineapples, and pepper was a rare recipe. Maybe Andrew Jackson was onto something with this dish. On one particular trip to England, Martin Van Buren, who was yet to be president, fell completely in love with the delicacy that is the boar. In particular, he grew quite fond of boar's head, which became a regular feature at his Christmas parties. Sounds like a scene straight out of a cartoon, right? Boar heads look just as big as they did in the TV shows. William Henry Harrison, on the other hand, was a bit more fond of lighter and protein-packed dishes like squirrel stew, which now would not pass at any table, but back in the 1890s was considered a dish worthy of the highest table in the country. In fact, the man loved his squirrels so much that he would hand out free stew at rallies and voter gatherings all across the nation as part of his campaign efforts. Talk about building goodwill. It seems John Tyler would manage the stress that came with the job of president with a heaping helping of chess pies. Most people would mistake this for a pudding, but to the careful Southern eye, it would be obvious that what you were looking at was a chess pie. Deeply aromatic and incredibly flavorful, it was a dish that recharged the brain immediately. James K. Paul was incredibly obsessed with ham and cornbread, which he recalls asking for specifically when he and his wife were trekking down the Mississippi, and when he was offered a standard New Orleans breakfast, he politely declined and just asked for ham and cornbread. Gotta love a leader that knows what they want, right? While the presidency of the United States of America has been a dark topic at some times, with conspiracies and assassinations everywhere you look, Zachary Taylor is probably the one president who made his bed and went to lie in it too. Zachary was an incredibly passionate enjoyer of Callous Thou Shods. If you are wondering what that is, these are fried sweet rice dumplings that had a surprisingly high level of cholesterol, especially with the amount he consumed. Even in the taste buds of our presidents, the influence of English cooking is clear. and Millard Fillmore's love of the resurrection pie is a testament to that. The dish was first invented somewhere in northern England, but it quickly made its way into most cookbooks in the States, and eventually, it found its way to the president's table. Really humble beginnings for such a grand-sounding dish, but there was nothing humble about that delicious flavor. Fanny daddies were a common sight at the table of Franklin Pierce, which again is another legacy item left to us by the British. Pierce himself was a New Hampshire local, so it makes sense why he would resonate so strongly with Fanny daddies. We think that regardless of your native country, anyone could come to appreciate a fried pastry this good. James Buchanan brings variety to this list just like he brought it to America's palate when he popularized sauerkraut, which was a classic German dish. Now, as studies in diets have come much further, the food itself, which is fermented cabbage, is regarded as a very healthy option to go for, but Buchanan appreciated it solely for the exquisite taste and crunch. The taste buds and personal anecdotes of the life of Abraham Lincoln remain largely a mystery to us even today. But one fact we can settle on for good is his intense appreciation for a banging corn cake. This man would gobble them up at 2.5 speed, and the ingredients for making one would often run dry in his pantry. Every person behind a big desk needs some superfood to keep their motivation going, right? Andrew Johnson particularly adored Hoppin' John, which his chef learned how to make authentically in Raleigh, North Carolina. A melodic fusion of tomatoes, black-eyed peas, and peppers, Patterson was head over heels for this comforting, homely meal, which brought a sense of replacement much needed to any presidential figure, especially in the time he was in office. While there was government protocol for Ulysses S. Grant whenever he stepped out, and none for the common folk who voted him in, one thing both he and the citizens shared deeply was their love of a fantastic rice pudding. Mr. Grant would typically ask his cooks to prepare this as an almost daily dish, claiming his day would not start without one. Rutherford B. Hayes was perhaps the most simple man on this entire list, which you may not expect from someone as sophisticated, assumingly, as the president. However, all he truly cared for when it came to food was just a good old corn on the cob. Corn soup, roasted corn, spicy corn, corn fritters, and cornbread, you get the idea. If it had anything even resembling a hint of corn in it, Hayes would make it a part of the White House's menu. William Henry Harrison and James A. Garfield are two presidents we think would have been best friends since they could bond over their mutual adoration for squirrels, even if Harrison loved his in a stew while Garfield preferred his in a soup. Squirrel-based dishes were extremely common in the southern parts of America, so it's not surprising that they made their way to the dining table of James A. Garfield. No honest-to-God American out there can deny the allure of a steak, but what about if it was a turtle steak? President Chester A. Arthur definitely thought it was more than agreeable, at least according to his preferences. Sea turtles used to be widely consumed in the 19th century until they were at risk of being endangered. But in those days, turtle steaks were actually surprisingly common, and this made its way to the president's cookbook. Grover Cleveland kept things a bit more traditional with his love for corned beef and cabbage, for which he once traded a gourmet meal prepared specifically for the president. Talk about dedication to the bit, or maybe it was not a bit since he claimed that was the best dinner he had ever had in months. Seems like pretty heartfelt praise to us. Fig pudding has always been a Christmas special, and in Benjamin Harrison's heart, it definitely held a place of honor. White House chef Francois Ricevi revealed that Harrison actually was an incredibly loyal fan of fig pudding and that no Christmas during his presidency was complete without a hefty serving. Red flannel hash might not bring any particular images to mind the way a quarter pounder with large fries does, but it definitely warmed William McKinley's heart. The dish is typically made from potatoes and beets, and it was more a veggie-orientated plate than anything else, which kind of defied standards for the White House. But what is tradition to the cravings of a dear president? We have our fair share of presidents who have dearly stuck to the customs of our country, and Theodore Roosevelt is the best proof. That man loved fried chicken almost as much as his job, and he recalls that it was a childhood favorite of his as his mother would always have piping, hot fried chicken ready with white gravy. Sounds like a heavenly dinner to us, to be honest. William Howard Taft was known for his intimidating figure, and you do not get a build like that just by sitting around signing off paperwork. Taft would build his strength the old-fashioned way, through a lot of protein. One of his best sources of it were these 12-ounce steaks that he would religiously eat every day, and if you manage to stomach that diet for a week, you'll know just how much of a bulk we are talking about here. Woodrow Wilson loved Virginia ham just as much as some other presidents here, and he was especially fond of having his fried and cut up into strips. Virginian ham has been used in such a massive range of dishes that having heaps of it in your kitchens alone could set you up for 4 kinds of food comas throughout the day, so honestly, pretty solid call on Wilson's part. Warren G. Harding was also a fan of sauerkraut, just like James Buchanan, but he liked his with a side of knockwurst. He would famously introduce all of the attendees at his parties and feasts to this dish and get them on the bandwagon. A dish must be pretty good to have a US president doing free promo for it. At least we hope it is. Calvin Coolidge had an extremely big sweet tooth, and what cheered him up after a long day of diplomatic relations and international politics would be a jelly roll packed to the brim with strawberry jam in a hefty wrapping sprinkled with lemon icing. Sounds like something that would definitely put the pep back in anyone's step. Herbert Hoover continued the White House's trend of sweet dishes with caramel tomatoes, which sound extremely unusual by today's standards, but were considered a delicacy during his tenure. Hoover loved this dish so much that his cook had to create a specific recipe catered exactly to his tastes. Grilled cheese sandwiches were a part of American history long before President Franklin D. Roosevelt, but nonetheless, he made sure they were cemented as the ideal American breakfast during his time. A grilled cheese sandwich, toasted fresh and hot, can often be the difference between a good morning and a bad one. And if you don't believe us, just ask the president. Harry S. Truman was one president who had a peculiar choice for afternoon meals, often opting for a plate of cornbread with sorghum instead of the fine 5-star delicacies the White House kitchens had to offer. He was a Missouri native, and the dish was a hit in the state after all. Dwight Eisenhower particularly preferred beef stew over all else, especially one that had been left to stew for 1,000,000 years, mixed with the freshest vegetables in all of America. The experience was kind of like the ending scene in Ratatouille. He also had a strong penchant for tomato broths, and it sounds like a beef stew worth trying to us. John F. Kennedy is one of the most memorable presidents in the history of the nation. But what people may not know is that a bowl of New England fish chowder outshone everything else for him. He always loved potatoes to boot, so his recipe included diced bits of it. A pretty handy dish if seafood is what gets you going. Barbecue is something that resonates as strongly with Americans as 2000s pop, and that really extends to all levels of society, including presidential. Lyndon B. Johnson, despite being a pretty picky eater, would never deny some beef or pork barbecued properly on a hot grill. She even invited a chef known as the Barbecue King from Texas to make the finest barbecue ever known to an American. Richard Nixon, on the other hand, preferred to keep things light and smooth with some cottage cheese. Definitely way better for your long-term gut health than constant barbecue. While it obviously did not offer the same explosive flavors of a typical cookout, Richard Nixon never seemed to mind as the president routinely had these for lunch. Plus, an ode made for Nixon and his wife even makes a reference to his long-held passion for cottage cheese. Gerald R. Ford is one of the lesser-known presidents of the time amidst all the recent political climate, but he did have good policies. He also had better taste in food, as the way to his heart was a pot roast with red cabbage. The library of Gerald R. Ford also claims that the dish was one of his top 5 at least, and that is saying something. Jimmy Carter was known to always like some peanuts, but what he really went crazy over were some cheesy grits. Now it was common knowledge that Carter always had a dairy fever, but that peaked at cheesy grits, which he made for his family even regularly. Cheesy grits are one of the easiest comfort foods to make, and we imagine comfort is something a president needs regularly. Now this one might really surprise you, but Ronald Reagan and jelly beans go way further back than we realize. Word is that he actually used them to quit smoking, and that his favorite flavor among the many was licorice. He even celebrated his inauguration with loads of jelly beans. George H.W. Bush resonated with the kids when it came to what he liked for dinner. No broccoli, fewer greens, and lots of pork rinds, which he liked with a specific Tabasco sauce. Mr. Bush did not play about his pork rinds and would buy snack variants of the dish at gas stations regularly. When interviewed and asked about it, Bill Clinton could not name anything but chicken enchiladas as his childhood favorite. His doctor also told him to get his fair share of lean protein, and Lord knows a chicken enchilada does wonders for that. George W. Bush, on the other hand, had taste buds that aligned more with modern-day teenagers. He favored the cheeseburger pizza, which he would not like from fast food joints, but would ask the White House cooks to recreate. Guess he liked to know where his food was coming from? Barack Obama has also kept it pretty humble and simple with his inner foodie, as all he likes is a good pot of chili that really awakens the soul. It turns out Obama even has a recipe that he has kept secret since his college days. Donald Trump, truly in line with the American spirit, preferred a filet-o-fish from McDonald's over the fine delicacies and multicultural cuisines his country has to offer. Perhaps keeping it nostalgic and simple is best. Joe Biden is actually quite the lover of ice cream, from local places like Jenny's Splendid Ice Cream in Ohio or Haagen-Dazs, and the White House keeps a big supply of vanilla chocolate chip ice cream. We know he's getting on in years, but it seems his inner child is still wide awake. Seems like our presidents have a lot in common with us when it comes to food. If you like the video and subscribe.